You know, there's something rather peculiar that happens when you begin to wake up. And by wake up, I don't mean simply opening your eyes in the morning or having a nice cup of coffee. I mean when you really begin to see through the game, when the veil of ordinary consciousness starts to slip and you catch a glimpse of what's actually going on here. It's quite marvelous, really. But here's the thing that nobody tells you. Once you've had that glimpse, once you've tasted that freedom, there are certain things you simply cannot share. Not because they're secret in some mystical hush-hush way, but because sharing them would be like trying to pour the ocean into a teacup. It just doesn't work. And more than that, attempting to do so can actually create more confusion than clarity. So let me tell you about 5 things that if you are spiritually awake, you should never share. Not out of spiritual pride, not because you're part of some exclusive club, but simply because these things cannot be communicated in the way that ordinary information can be communicated. They're more like the scent of a flower. You can describe it all day long, but until someone smells it for themselves, they haven't really got it. Now, the first thing you must never share is your direct experience of awakening itself. You see, the moment you wake up, there's this tremendous urge to tell everyone about it. You want to grab people by the shoulders and say, look, I've seen it, it's all right here. We've been looking in the wrong direction the whole time. But what happens when you do this? The other person looks at you with a mixture of confusion and concern. They nod politely. They might even say, that's wonderful for you. But inside they're thinking you've gone a bit strange. Why is this? Because awakening is not an idea. It's not a concept that can be passed from one mind to another, like a recipe for bread. It's a lived reality. It's the difference between reading about swimming and actually being in the water. When you try to describe the water to someone who's never been wet, what do they hear? Just words, just sounds. The actual feeling of water, the way it holds you, the way it moves around your body, that cannot be captured in language. I once knew a man who had what you might call a profound spiritual experience. He was walking in the garden one evening, and suddenly everything became transparent. He saw that he was not a separate being walking through a garden, but rather the entire process of gardening was happening. There was no walker and no garden, just walking, gardening as one movement. Well, he was so excited by this that he rushed to tell his wife. And what did she say? She said, "That's nice, dear. Don't forget to take out the rubbish." You see, she couldn't receive what he was trying to give because she hadn't had the experience. It's like trying to explain the color red to someone who was born blind. You can talk about wavelengths of light. You can describe how it makes you feel. But you cannot give them the direct experience of redness. And spiritual awakening is far more subtle than even that. So what happens when you insist on sharing this experience? You begin to sound like you're bragging. Oh, I've had this marvelous insight. I've seen the truth. I understand what life is really about. And immediately, you've created a division. You've put yourself over here as the awakened one, and the other person over there as the unawakened one. And in doing so, you've actually contradicted the very insight you were trying to share, which is that there is no division, no separation, no you and them. The awakened person learns to be quiet about their awakening. Not out of false modesty, but because they understand that talking about it is like a finger pointing at the moon. The finger is useful if someone wants to look where it's pointing. But if they're fascinated by the finger itself, they'll miss the moon entirely. And most people, when you try to share your awakening, become fascinated by your finger. They want to know what you did to get awakened. They want the technique, the method, the secret practice. But awakening didn't happen because you did something. It happened when you stopped doing and simply saw what was already there. The second thing you must never share is the specific practices or methods that worked for you. Now, this might sound contradictory. Surely if something worked for you, wouldn't it be helpful to tell others? But here's the trick. What worked for you worked because it was right for you. at that particular moment in your life. It fit your temperament, your situation, your particular flavor of confusion. Imagine you have a headache and you take a certain medicine and the headache goes away. Does this mean everyone with a headache should take that same medicine? Of course not. One person's headache might be from tension, another's from lack of sleep, another's from dehydration. The same medicine won't work for all of them. In fact, it might harm some of them. Spiritual practices are exactly like this. What brings one person to clarity might trap another person in technique. I might sit quietly and watch my breath, and in that watching, suddenly see through the illusion of the separate self. But if I tell you, you must sit and watch your breath, you might spend years sitting and watching and getting absolutely nowhere, because your particular knot is different from mine. There was a student who came to his teacher and said, "Master, I've been meditating for 5 years, just as you instructed, and I still haven't had any awakening." The teacher laughed and said, "Perhaps you should stop meditating." The student was shocked. "But you told me to meditate." "Yes," said the teacher, "and now I'm telling you to stop. You've turned meditation into another form of striving, another way of trying to become something you think you're not. Stop trying to be awakened and see if you're not already awake." You see, the moment you give someone a method, they turn it into a goal. They think, if I do this practice correctly, I will achieve enlightenment. And now they're further from awakening than when they started, because they've created a future moment when they imagine they'll be complete. But awakening is not in the future. It's only now. It's seeing what's already here, not creating something new. The third thing you must never share are your insights about other people. When you wake up, one of the things that happens is you begin to see people very clearly. You see through their masks, their pretenses, their games. You can see when someone is operating from fear, when they're defending an image, when they're lost in their own story. And there's a tremendous temptation to help them by pointing this out. But this is almost always a mistake. Why? Because people are not ready to see themselves until they're ready. And when they're ready, they'll see it themselves. They don't need you to tell them. In fact, if you tell them before they're ready, you'll only create resistance and resentment. Think about it this way. Suppose you see a butterfly struggling to emerge from its cocoon. You think, "Oh, I can't help. I'll cut open the cocoon and free the butterfly. But if you do this, the butterfly will die." Why? Because the struggle to emerge is what strengthens its wings. Without that struggle, it cannot fly. In the same way, people need to struggle with their own confusions in their own time. Your helpful insight, delivered before they're ready for it, might actually harm them. I remember sitting with a friend who was going on and on about how unfairly he'd been treated at his work. He'd been passed over for promotion, and he was convinced it was because his boss had something against him. Now, I could see quite clearly what was actually happening. My friend had a certain arrogance, a way of dismissing others' ideas that made him difficult to work with. This was the real reason he wasn't promoted. But did I tell him this? No. Because he wasn't asking to see himself clearly. He was asking for validation of his victim story. If I'd said, "Actually, you're rather arrogant and dismissive," what would have happened? He would have become defensive. He might have ended our friendship, and he still wouldn't have seen the truth, because he wasn't ready to see it. So instead, I listened. I made sympathetic noises. And then months later, without any prompting from me, he suddenly said, "You know, I think I might have been a bit difficult to work with." There it was. The insight arose in him naturally when he was ready for it. The awakened person learns to trust this natural process. They don't rush around trying to enlighten everyone. They understand that consciousness awakens in its own time, like a flower opening in the morning. You cannot force the petals open. You can only provide the right conditions and then step back. The fourth thing you must never share is your experience of the void, the emptiness, the fundamental groundlessness of existence. This is perhaps the most dangerous thing to share, because it can be deeply disturbing to someone who isn't ready for it. You see, when you really wake up, one of the things you see is that there's nothing solid anywhere. Everything you thought was permanent and real turns out to be more like a dance, a flow, a process. Your own sense of self, which feels so solid and continuous, is actually more like a river. You can say there's a river, but if you try to grab it, you get nothing but water passing through your fingers. The river is not a thing. It's a happening. Now, this realization can be incredibly liberating. It means you're not stuck being who you think you are. It means all your problems, all your anxieties, all your carefully constructed identities are like clouds passing through the sky. But to someone who hasn't seen this yet, it sounds terrifying. It sounds like you're saying nothing matters, that everything is meaningless, that we're all just random collections of atoms bouncing around with no purpose. I once made the mistake of trying to explain this to a colleague. We were having dinner, and he was talking about his plans for the future, all the things he wanted to achieve, the person he wanted to become. And I said rather unwisely, "You know, there really is no you to achieve anything. What you call yourself is just a pattern, a habit of thought. It's not real in the way you think it's real." Well, he looked at me as if I'd just announced I was going to rob a bank. "What are you talking about?" he said. "Of course I'm real. I'm sitting right here. I have thoughts, feelings, memories. How can you say I'm not real?" And then he became quite upset. He thought I was denying his existence, dismissing his life as meaningless. What I was actually trying to say is that he's real, but not in the way he imagines. He's not a separate, isolated self trapped in a bag of skin. He's the whole universe expressing itself as a particular pattern called him. But he couldn't hear this because it threatened his entire sense of identity. And without a stable sense of identity, he felt he would fall apart. This is why the great teachers throughout history have been very careful about who they share the deepest teachings with. They understood that these teachings are like medicine. In the right dose, at the right time, they heal. In the wrong dose at the wrong time, they poison. The truth about emptiness, about the void, about the groundlessness of existence, this truth must be approached gradually, gently, or it can shatter someone's world before they have the capacity to rebuild it. And the fifth thing you must never share is your sense of ultimate freedom and why you no longer feel bound by conventional rules and morality. When you wake up, you see that all the rules, all the shoulds and shouldn'ts, all the moral codes and social conventions are just agreements, games we've all decided to play. And you realize you're free to play or not play as you choose. But if you announce this to people, if you say, "I'm beyond good and evil," I no longer follow conventional morality, because I see it's all just made up. People will think you've become dangerous. They'll think you're going to start robbing banks or harming people, because you no longer believe in moral rules. What they don't understand is that true freedom is not the freedom to harm. When you really wake up, you see that harming others is harming yourself, because there is no real separation. The person you hurt is just another aspect of the same consciousness that you are. So naturally, spontaneously, you treat others with kindness, not because a rule tells you to, but because that's what flows naturally from the understanding of unity. A truly free person follows the spirit of the law while being free of the letter of the law. They act morally not out of fear of punishment or hope of reward, but because moral action is simply what happens when you see clearly. They're kind not because kindness is virtuous, but because unkindness would be as strange as punching yourself in the face. But try explaining this to someone who still believes morality comes from external authority, from God or society, or some cosmic rule book. They cannot understand how you can be both free from morally rules and yet act morally. To them it seems like a contradiction. So they assume you're either lying about your freedom or you're secretly immoral and just haven't acted on it yet. The awakened person learns to follow social conventions, even while knowing their convention. They play the game because not playing would create unnecessary conflict and confusion. They pay their bills, they obey traffic laws, they treat people with respect, not because they must, but because it's simply easier and more harmonious to do so. They're like a master actor who knows it's all a play, but gives their performance everything they've got anyway. So there you have it. 5 things you must never share if you are spiritually awake. Your direct experience of awakening, your specific practices and methods, your insights about other people, your understanding of emptiness and groundlessness, and your sense of freedom from conventional morality. Does this mean you can never talk about spiritual matters? Of course not. But there's a difference between pointing towards something and claiming to have captured it. There's a difference between offering a possibility and insisting on a conclusion. The awakened person speaks, but they speak lightly. They suggest rather than assert. They invite rather than command. They know that words are fingers pointing at the moon, and they never confuse the finger with the moon itself. And perhaps most importantly, they've learned that the deepest teaching is not in words at all. It's in presence. It's in the way they move through the world. It's in their laugh, their silence, their simple being. People might not understand what you say about awakening, but they can feel when they're in the presence of someone who's awake. They feel it as a kind of peace, a kind of spaciousness, a sense that this person is somehow at home in the universe in a way that most people aren't. So be quiet about your awakening. Live it rather than talk about it. And trust that those who are ready to wake up will wake up, not because you pushed them, but because consciousness itself is waking up through all of us, each in our own time, each in our own way. You're not the awakener. You're just another expression of the awakening that's always already happening. And if someone really wants to know, if they really come to you with genuine curiosity and readiness, then by all means speak. But speak as one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread, not as someone who has arrived telling someone else how to get there. Because the beautiful secret is this: there's nowhere to get to. We're already there. We've always been there. We're just playing this magnificent game of pretending we're not.
What a peculiar game we play with ourselves. We fret and worry about this thing called death, this great unknown that awaits us somewhere in the murky future. We spend fortunes trying to postpone it, religions trying to transcend it, philosophies trying to make sense of it. And yet we completely overlook something rather extraordinary. You've already experienced what death is. Before you were born, before you were conceived, where were you? What was your experience for those billions of years that the universe existed without this particular arrangement of matter and consciousness that you call myself? Were you suffering? Were you afraid? Were you anything at all? This state of non-being, this absence of your particular form of consciousness, it's not theoretical. It's not imaginary. It's a condition you've already been in. And somehow, remarkably, here you are now, having emerged from that very state you so deeply fear returning to. I want to explore with you this profound paradox, that the thing we most dread is something we've already experienced. And in understanding this circular nature of existence, we might just discover a radically different way of being alive right now, not as temporary visitors to an alien world, but as expressions of an eternal process that has no true beginning and no final end. Let's dive into this mystery together. We have this peculiar idea, you see, that there was a definite moment when you began, a precise instant when you came into being. Birth seems like such a clear starting point, doesn't it? But I want to suggest something rather revolutionary. What if this whole idea of having a beginning is just a convenient fiction? Consider a wave in the ocean. When exactly does a wave begin? Can you point to the precise moment when it becomes distinct from the rest of the sea? Of course not. The wave is a pattern, a behavior of the entire ocean. It doesn't come from the ocean or go back to it. It is the ocean, temporarily playing at being a wave. Similarly, you are not something that came into the world. You are something the world is doing. Just as an apple tree apples, the universe peoples. You didn't arrive here from somewhere else. You grew out of this reality like a fruit from a tree. So when we say you've already died before being born, I'm suggesting that the state you emerged from isn't foreign territory at all. It's the very stuff from which you are eternally emerging and to which you are eternally returning. Birth and death are not entrances and exits, but transformations of the same continuum. What we call the beginning is often merely the eye opening after a blink, not the creation of the eye itself. Isn't that a fascinating way to consider yourself? Not as something with a clear start and end, but as a pattern that the universe is forever weaving and unweaving. Now, what about this state we call death? 0. 5. This great unknown that looms ahead of us, filling so many with absolute terror. This thing that we spend enormous amounts of energy avoiding, denying, postponing. What if I told you that you've already experienced it? You see, the state of not existing as you isn't some mysterious condition you've never encountered. It's precisely where you were before your birth. For billions of years, the universe got along perfectly well without this particular arrangement of energy and matter that you call myself. And how did that feel to you? It didn't feel like anything, did it? It wasn't painful. It wasn't frightening. It wasn't even boring. As Mark Twain so cleverly put it, I do not fear death. I had been dead for billions and billions of years before I was born, and had not suffered the slightest inconvenience from it. Isn't that marvelous? What we fear is not death itself, but the process of dying, the anticipation of an end. Yet death itself is simply the other bookend to birth, the complementary state from which we emerged and to which we return. It's as natural to us as the darkness before dawn. Consider how curious it is that we don't spend any time at all worrying about our non-existence before birth. Nobody lies awake at night distressed about all those centuries they missed. Yet the prospect of missing future centuries fills us with dread. Isn't that an odd asymmetry? Perhaps it reveals something about the real nature of our fear. What we truly fear, you see, is not non-existence, but the loss of what we have now. And yet the fact that you emerged once from non-being might suggest something rather wonderful about the nature of existence itself. Let's look more closely at consciousness itself. We tend to think of awareness as a continuous state, like a light that turns on at birth and off at death. But is that really how consciousness operates? When you observe your own awareness carefully, you'll notice it has a pulsing, rhythmic quality. It's not a solid state, but more like a flickering flame. You're aware, then momentarily distracted, then aware again. You're present, then daydreaming, then present once more. You're awake, then asleep, then awake again. Every night when you fall into deep, dreamless sleep, your consciousness as you know it temporarily ceases. And yet, you don't fear going to sleep, do you? You surrender to it gladly. You trust implicitly that awareness will return, even though, strictly speaking, the you that wakes up is not identical to the you that went to sleep. Your cells have changed, your thoughts have shifted, your memories have been reorganized. Consciousness, you see, is not a continuous possession, but a rhythmic process. Like breathing, it naturally expands and contracts. Like a heartbeat, it pulses between states. And like the tide, it flows in and out. This pulsing nature of consciousness offers us a profound insight into life and death. Perhaps death is not the final switching off of a light, but simply the longest phase of its natural flickering. Perhaps non-being is not the opposite of being, but its necessary counterpart in the greater rhythm of existence. Just as the space between musical notes is essential to the melody, perhaps the intervals of non-existence are essential to the symphony of being. And if consciousness has emerged once from the void, who's to say it cannot emerge again? Not as the same melody, perhaps, but as part of the ever-changing music of the cosmos. Now, You might reasonably ask, if I've already experienced death before birth, why don't I remember it? And that's a perfectly sensible question. But let me ask you this, do you remember being born? Do you remember your first year of life? For most of us, these formative experiences are completely inaccessible to memory. Memory, you see, is not a perfect recording of experience. It's a selective creative process that requires certain neural structures to be in place. We don't remember things that happened before those structures developed. And we certainly can't remember a state where there was no we to do the remembering. But absence of memory doesn't equal absence of experience or connection. Consider the ancient symbol of the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail. It represents the cycle of death and rebirth, the eternal return. Many of the world's great philosophical traditions have suggested that existence moves not in a straight line but in a great circle, or perhaps a spiral. The Hindus speak of samsara, the Buddhists of the wheel of becoming. The ancient Greeks had their concept of eternal recurrence. All pointing to the same intuition that what appears to be an ending may in fact be part of a greater cycle. I'm not necessarily suggesting literal reincarnation here. Rather, I'm inviting you to consider that the boundary between being and non-being may be more permeable than we imagine. That consciousness may be less like a possession and more like a process that the universe enacts through countless forms. After all, the atoms in your body once existed in stars. The carbon that forms your cells has been part of countless other living beings. In a very real, material sense, you are the universe recycling itself. Your consciousness may well be doing the same thing at a deeper level. So perhaps we don't remember our prior non-existence for the same reason a wave doesn't remember when it was part of the undifferentiated ocean. Not because that state was unreal, but because it was too fundamental to be captured by memory. Let's think about this whole business of existence in another way. What if the universe at its core is playful? What if existence itself is a magnificent game of hide and seek? Consider, what would it be like to be God, or the Tao, or the fundamental consciousness, whatever term you prefer for the ultimate reality? If you were all-knowing, all-powerful, and eternal, what would you lack? The answer, curiously enough, is ignorance, limitation, the thrill of discovery, the excitement of not knowing what comes next. And so perhaps the ultimate reality plays a cosmic game of hide and seek with itself. It pretends to divide into countless separate beings, each one forgetting the wholeness from which it came. Each one experiencing the delicious limitation of being just this, just here, just now. In this view, birth is when the universal consciousness narrows its focus into a particular form. It's the universe playing at being you, specifically, with all your unique limitations and perspectives. And death is when that focus widens again, returning to the broader awareness from which it came. As I've often suggested, each of us is the universe experiencing itself from a particular point of view. Your eyes are the universe seeing. Your ears are the universe hearing. Your thoughts are the universe thinking. And in this great game, the transitions between being and non-being are not tragic accidents, but essential moves in the cosmic play. Just as a game of hide and seek requires both hiding and being found, existence requires both being and non-being to be complete. So perhaps you've already died before being born in the same way that a player in hide and seek has already been it before hiding. It's simply part of the greater game that makes the whole thing possible and worthwhile. Now let's confront this business of fear directly. Why does death terrify us so profoundly if it's a state we've already experienced? 0. 5. I believe there are several layers to this fear, and each one is worth examining carefully. First, there's the fear of the unknown. But as we've discussed, death isn't entirely unknown to us. It's the state we emerged from, the great background from which our temporary form arose. In this sense, death may be more familiar than we realize. Then there's the fear of loss, of our possessions, our relationships, our experiences, our very identity. This fear has some substance to it, I admit. But it's based on a curious assumption that we truly possess these things in the first place. When you look closely at your experience, you'll notice that everything is constantly flowing, changing, transforming. Your body is not the same body it was 7 years ago. Virtually every cell has been replaced. Your mind is not the same mind it was when you were a child. Your thoughts, beliefs, and perceptions have all transformed. So, what exactly is this you that fears its own extinction? Is it not itself a process rather than a fixed entity? A verb rather than a noun? A song rather than a singer? As the Buddhists so wisely point out, perhaps our deepest fear stems from clinging to a sense of separate self that was never quite real in the way we imagined. The fear of death may be the shadow cast by our attachment to a phantom. But there's another layer to our fear that's particularly fascinating. We fear death most intensely when we feel we haven't truly lived. When we sense we've been merely existing rather than fully embracing the gift of life. When we've been too afraid, too cautious, too conformist to express our authentic nature. Ironically, it's often our fear of death that prevents us from truly living. We become so concerned with preserving our life that we forget to use it, to spend it, to live it fully. Like a miser who starves to death atop a pile of gold, we cling so tightly to life that we never truly experience it. Understanding that you've already been in the state of non-existence and survived it, so to speak, can be profoundly liberating. It suggests that what we call death is not the opposite of life, but simply another aspect of the greater cycle of being. Let's challenge another assumption that underlies our fear of death, the notion of linear time. We tend to imagine time as an arrow moving in one direction only, from past to future, from birth to death. But is this the only way to understand time? Many of the world's wisdom traditions suggest otherwise. They speak of time as cyclical rather than linear. Think of the seasons constantly rotating, the planets endlessly orbiting, day following night following day. Nature doesn't move in straight lines, but in circles and spirals. When we observe our own experience closely, we notice that psychological time isn't linear either. It expands and contracts according to our state of mind. A minute of boredom can feel like an hour, 0. 5. An hour of fascination can feel like a minute. In dreams and deep meditation, time as we normally experience it seems to dissolve altogether. What if time as we understand it is simply another construct of our particular mode of consciousness? What if the separation between past, present, and future is a useful illusion rather than an absolute reality? Physicists like Einstein have shown that time and space are not separate dimensions, but aspects of a unified space-time continuum. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that all possible states exist simultaneously, and it's only our observation that collapses these possibilities into a single timeline. If time is less like an arrow and more like a dance, then birth and death may not be the absolute beginning and end we imagine them to be. They may be more like transitions in an endless cosmic choreography, movements in an eternal symphony that has no first note and no final chord. In this view, you've already died before being born, not just in the sense of having experienced non-existence, but in the deeper sense that the divisions between past, present, and future are themselves relative rather than absolute. The before and after exist together in a greater whole, like different facets of a single gem. This perspective doesn't necessarily make death less real, but it does transform how we understand it, not as a final ending in linear time, but as a transition in the circular dance of existence. One of the most persistent illusions of human existence is the search for permanence in an impermanent world. We desperately want things to last forever. We want security, stability, certainty. We build monuments, create legacies, and establish traditions, all in an attempt to transcend the flow of change. But look around you. Is there anything in this universe that truly remains unchanged? Mountains erode, stars explode, continents drift, species evolve, civilizations rise and fall. Even the atoms in your body are in constant motion. Change is not something that happens to an otherwise stable universe. Change is what the universe is. As Heraclitus wisely observed, no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man. This impermanence terrifies us because we've been taught to identify with the changeless. We think we are our name, our body, our memories, our personality, all of which we expect to remain relatively stable. But these are more like patterns in a flowing stream than solid objects. The Eastern traditions have long recognized this truth. The Buddhists call it anicca, the understanding that all conditioned existence is transient. The Taoists describe reality as a constant interplay of yin and yang, forever transforming into each other. The Hindus portray the universe as the dance of Shiva, creating and destroying in the same divine movement. When we deeply accept the truth of impermanence, something remarkable happens. We realize there was never anything to hold on to in the first place, and therefore nothing to lose. The fear of death begins to dissolve not because we found some magical escape from it, but because we understand that the separate permanent self we thought we were protecting never really existed. What exists instead is far more wonderful, a conscious process intimately connected with the whole universe, temporarily taking the form we call me, but always part of the greater flow of being. Not a noun, but a verb. Not a thing, but an event. Not a product, but a process. In this light, you've already died before being born, because the separate self is constantly dying and being reborn in each moment. The person you were yesterday has already died. The person you will be tomorrow is yet to be born. And the real you is not found in either place, but in the awareness that witnesses this endless transformation. When discussing cycles of existence, people often jump to the idea of reincarnation, the notion that you as a specific individual will be reborn as another specific individual. But I want to suggest something both simpler and more profound. The universe has a remarkable habit of repeating its patterns, not in exactly the same way, but in endlessly creative variations. One leaf is never identical to another, yet the pattern of leafness continues. One wave is never the same as another, yet the pattern of waveness persists. Similarly, the pattern we call consciousness or awareness continues to manifest in countless forms, not as a soul migrating from body to body, but as the universe's inherent capacity to know itself, to be aware, to experience, emerging wherever the conditions are right. Just as your body is made from elements that have been recycled through countless other forms, perhaps your consciousness is a particular expression of an awareness that has manifested countless times before and will manifest countless times again. Not as you specifically, but as the miracle of consciousness itself. When a wave returns to the ocean, it doesn't cease to exist. It continues as the ocean, and from that same ocean, new waves will inevitably arise. Not the same wave reincarnated, but the same water reformed. In the same way, when your individual consciousness returns to the greater consciousness from which it emerged, it doesn't cease to exist. It continues as that greater consciousness. And from that same source, new instances of awareness will inevitably emerge. Not you reincarnated, but the same awareness reformed. This perspective offers a different kind of immortality, not the continuation of a separate self, but participation in the eternal dance of being and becoming. Not your personal survival, but your essential continuity with all that is. In this sense, you've already died before being born, because the awareness that you are has already been through countless cycles of formation and dissolution. The particular pattern you call me may be unique, but the substance of which it's made, both physical and conscious, has been recycling since the beginning of time. So what does all this mean for how we live right now, in this very moment? 0. 5. How does the understanding that you've already died before being born transform your experience of being alive? First, it invites a profound shift in perspective. When you realize that what you call myself is not a separate entity that popped into existence at birth and will disappear at death, but a temporary pattern in the eternal flow of being, your entire relationship with life can transform. You begin to identify not with the pattern, which is indeed temporary, but with the awareness that perceives the pattern. And that awareness, I suggest, is continuous with the fundamental consciousness of the universe itself. Second, this understanding can dramatically reduce the fear of death, not by promising some kind of personal survival, but by revealing that what truly survives doesn't need your protection or concern. Just as a wave doesn't need to worry about returning to the ocean, it is the ocean, temporarily in wave form, you don't need to worry about returning to the source of being. You are that source, temporarily in human form. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the recognition that death is not foreign to you but intimately familiar can profoundly enhance your appreciation of life. When you stop seeing death as the enemy of life and start seeing it as life's complement, its necessary partner in the dance of existence, you can embrace the entire cycle with gratitude rather than resistance. The Japanese have a beautiful concept called mono no aware, the pathos of things. It's the wistful recognition that the impermanence of things is precisely what makes them precious. The cherry blossom is especially beloved because it blooms so briefly. The autumn moon touches us so deeply because it will soon be gone. In the same way, our lives become more precious, not less, when we acknowledge their transience. Every experience becomes more valuable, not less, when we recognize it will never be repeated in exactly the same way. Every relationship becomes more meaningful, not less, when we understand it exists within the context of impermanence. When you truly understand that you've already died before being born, death ceases to be a fearful future event and becomes part of your lived experience of the present. You realize that what you're experiencing right now, this consciousness, this awareness, this being, is precisely what continues. Not as you specifically, but as the miracle of existence itself, forever finding new forms through which to experience its own infinite wonder. And so, paradoxically, by embracing death as an old friend rather than a dreaded stranger, you become more fully alive. By accepting that your current form is temporary, you can appreciate its uniqueness more deeply. By recognizing that you are not separate from the rest of existence, but intimately connected with it, you can experience the kind of belonging and meaning that no amount of personal survival could provide. This is the wisdom that death offers to life. Not that you must survive at all costs, but that you are already part of something that cannot die because it was never born in the conventional sense. Not that you must accumulate experiences before time runs out, but that you are the timeless awareness in which all experiences arise and dissolve. As we bring our exploration to a close, I invite you to consider a simple truth. The fact that you exist at all is the real miracle. Not that you might continue existing forever, but that you exist now. That out of infinite possibilities, this particular configuration of energy and consciousness that you call myself has manifested. That out of the vast ocean of potential being, this specific wave has arisen. When you truly grasp this, gratitude becomes the most natural response. Not grasping for more time, more experiences, more life, but profound appreciation for the gift of being here at all, for however brief a moment in the cosmic scale. You've already died before being born, and yet, here you are. That's the mystery and the miracle. That's the dance of existence that never truly begins and never truly ends, but continually transforms itself through countless forms, each one unique, each one precious, each one a temporary expression of the eternal now. So I leave you with this thought: don't be afraid to die, for you've done it before. And don't forget to live, for this particular dance will never come again. Embrace both the forming and the dissolving as equally sacred aspects of the same divine play. And in doing so, discover what it means to be truly, fully, gloriously alive. You know, I've been thinking about something rather extraordinary lately. Something that most people find terribly disturbing, yet I find it to be the most liberating realization one could possibly have. It's simply this: you have already died. Not only that, but you will die again today, tomorrow, and every moment hereafter. And isn't that the most marvelous thing? Let me show you why this seemingly morbid thought might just be the key to truly living. What a curious game we play with ourselves, this persistent fantasy that we remain the same person throughout our lives. I am Alan Watts, I say. But who exactly is this I that I so confidently proclaim to be? If you look very carefully at what you call yourself, you'll discover something quite astonishing. There is no persistent entity, no unchanging core that you can point to and say, that's me. You see, the you of yesterday has completely vanished. The cells in your body are not the same, the thoughts in your mind have changed, your feelings have shifted. We maintain this illusion of continuity by telling ourselves stories. I am the person who grew up in such and such a place, who had these particular experiences, who holds these specific memories. But memories themselves are not fixed. They transform, fade, and are recreated with each recall. It's rather like watching a film, isn't it? The apparent continuity of motion is actually a series of still frames, flickering past at such speed that we perceive continuous movement. In much the same way, your life isn't continuous at all. It's a series of moments, of deaths and rebirths, happening so rapidly that you're fooled into seeing permanence where none exists. And how marvelously liberating this can be when you truly understand it. For if there is no solid, unchangeable you, then who is there to be hurt? Who is there to fail? Who is there to die? Now, let's consider what we mean by death. Most people think of it as an end, a terrifying finality. But I want to suggest something rather revolutionary, that there is no such thing as death in the way we commonly understand it. Look at nature for a moment. When an autumn leaf falls from a tree, we don't mourn it as a tragedy, we recognize it as part of a cycle. That leaf doesn't disappear into nothingness. It decomposes, becomes soil, feeds the tree from which it fell, and eventually becomes new leaves. It transforms. You are no different from that leaf. The universe is, as I like to call it, a grand cosmic recycling program. Nothing is ever truly created or destroyed, it simply changes form. The elements that compose your body today were once part of stars, of oceans, of countless other living beings. And they will be again. This is what the Buddhists understand so beautifully when they speak of anicca, or impermanence. Everything flows, everything changes. The you that existed yesterday has transformed into something new today. 0. 5. The you of this moment is already becoming the you of the next. When you realize this, death loses its sting. What we call death is merely a particularly dramatic transformation, one moment in an endless dance of becoming. You see, you haven't just died once at the end of your life. You've been dying and being reborn with every passing moment. The child you were has died to become the adult you are. The person you were a decade ago, a year ago, even yesterday, has died to become who you are now. And isn't that a far more fascinating proposition than some dreary eternity of unchanging existence? This cosmic recycling program isn't something to fear, it's something to celebrate. For in this endless transformation lies the very miracle of existence itself. Let's explore something peculiar about this present moment. We tend to think of ourselves as moving through time, as though we're travelers on a journey from past to future. But that's not quite right. You don't move through time, time moves through you. Consider this. The you that began reading these words is already gone. With each word, each breath, you are being recreated anew. The person who started this sentence is not, strictly speaking, the same person who will finish it. It's a rather marvelous paradox, isn't it? The only moment that ever exists is now, and yet this now is constantly vanishing, constantly being reborn. The present moment is like a knife edge between past and future, infinitesimally thin, yet all that ever truly exists. This is why I say, you died yesterday. Every version of you that has ever existed has already died, transformed into something new. The child you once were is dead. The teenager you once were is dead. The person you were last year, last month, yesterday, all dead. And the person you are right now is dying even as these words reach you. Now, most people find this terribly frightening. We cling to the illusion of continuity because we fear this constant dissolution. But what if, just what if, this constant death and rebirth is the greatest gift we've been given? For in this endless recycling of the self lies our greatest freedom. If the you of the past is already gone, then you're not bound by who you were. Your mistakes, your regrets, your limitations, they belong to someone who no longer exists. And the you of this moment is free to be born anew, unconstrained by what came before. Isn't that extraordinary? The ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus once made a fascinating observation. He said, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man." What a beautiful articulation of this principle we've been exploring. Consider a river for a moment. We give it a name, the Thames, the Ganges, the Mississippi, and treat it as a constant, stable thing. But what is a river, really? It's water in constant flux, never the same from one moment to the next. The water that was there yesterday has flowed away to the sea. The riverbed itself is slowly changing, eroding here, building up there. Even the banks are gradually shifting. Yet we persist in this curious illusion that the river is a permanent, unchanging entity. Ah yes, the old Thames, just as it's always been. What nonsense when you really think about it. Your identity is precisely like that river. You give it a name, tell yourself stories about its permanence, but in reality it's in constant flux. The thoughts, feelings, sensations, and perceptions that constitute you are never the same from one moment to the next. They flow through you like water through a riverbed. The fascinating thing is that both the river and your sense of self exist in this paradoxical state, constantly changing, yet maintaining a recognizable pattern. The pattern remains, while the substance transforms. When you truly grasp this, you begin to see the absurdity of clinging to some fixed notion of who you are. That's not like me, you might say, or I could never do that. But who is this me or I that you're referring to? It's a pattern in flux, not a fixed entity. So you see, you died yesterday in the most literal sense. The person you were has flowed away like water in a river, never to return. And you will die today and tomorrow and the next day, transformed endlessly into new versions of yourself. The only constant is change itself. And isn't that a liberating thought? Now we come to something rather interesting, the ego and its peculiar relationship with death. The ego, you see, is a rather curious fellow. It's essentially a social construction, a collection of ideas about who you are, maintained through an ongoing internal monologue. I am this kind of person. I have these particular talents. I believe these specific things. On and on it goes. And this ego, this chattering mind that calls itself I, has one overwhelming fear, its own non-existence. It clings desperately to the illusion of permanence, because to acknowledge impermanence is to acknowledge its own unreality. And that, my friends, is something the ego simply cannot bear. This is why most people find the idea of death so terrifying. It's not really death itself they fear. After all, how could you fear something you've never experienced? No, what they fear is the ego's interpretation of death, the end of me, the cessation of this story I've been telling myself about who I am. But here's the delicious irony. The ego that fears death is itself an illusion. It's like a character in a novel, worrying about what will happen when the book ends. The character was never real to begin with. When you begin to see through this illusion, something remarkable happens. The fear of death starts to dissolve. For if there is no permanent you to begin with, then what is there to die? If you're already dying and being reborn with every passing moment, then the big death at the end of life loses its fearsome aspect. It's just one more transformation in an endless series of transformations. This is what the mystics and sages have been telling us throughout history. To die before you die, to recognize the illusory nature of the ego while still alive, is to discover a profound freedom. For when you no longer identify exclusively with this phantom called me, you open yourself to the vastness of what you truly are. And that, my friends, is beyond birth and death altogether. Let's talk about reincarnation, but perhaps not in the way you might expect. Many traditions speak of being reborn after death, returning in a new form. But I want to suggest something far more immediate and radical, that reincarnation is happening right now, in this very moment. You see, we typically think of reincarnation as something that happens after the body dies. But what if the truth is far more astonishing? What if you are being reincarnated with every breath, every heartbeat, every passing moment? Consider this. The person you were when you woke up this morning has already died. The cells in your body have changed. The thoughts in your mind have shifted. The emotional weather within you has transformed. You have, in a very real sense, been reincarnated as a slightly different person. This isn't mere poetic metaphor, it's literal truth. The atoms that constitute your body are constantly being replaced. The air you breathe becomes you, and then leaves you to become something else. The food you eat transforms into your flesh and blood, only to be broken down and expelled. You are, quite literally, a process rather than a thing. In Zen Buddhism, there's a concept called shoji, which means birth, death. Not birth and death as separate events, but birth, death as a single, ongoing process. Life and death aren't opposites. They're two aspects of the same reality, happening simultaneously, continuously. Every moment, something in you is dying to make way for something new to be born. A thought dies as a new one is born. An inhalation dies into an exhalation. A feeling dissolves as another arises. This is reincarnation without reincarnating, the constant, immediate recycling of the self. Once you become aware of this continuous birth-death process, you begin to see that there's no need to wait for some future rebirth. You're already experiencing it. The question isn't whether you'll be reborn after death. The question is whether you can be present for the rebirth that's happening right now, in this very moment. Can you die willingly to what was and be born fully into what is? That's the real spiritual practice. Now, all this talk about constant dying and being reborn might sound rather disturbing. Most of us prefer stability, predictability, permanence. We want solid ground beneath our feet. But what if the greatest liberation comes precisely from embracing this constant dissolution? You see, our suffering largely comes from resistance. We resist what is wishing things were different. We cling to the past, fearful of letting go. We grasp at the future, anxious about what might be. And in this resistance, this clinging and grasping, we create our own pain. But what happens when you fully accept the truth of impermanence? When you stop resisting the fact that you're constantly dying and being reborn, something quite extraordinary occurs. First, the fear begins to dissolve. If you accept that nothing lasts, including your own identity, then there's nothing to cling to and therefore nothing to fear losing. The fear of death is essentially the fear of losing what you never really had to begin with, a permanent, unchanging self. Second, you discover a profound freedom. If you're not bound by a fixed identity, if you're constantly being reborn, then you're free to reinvent yourself in each new moment. The mistakes of the past don't define you because that person is already gone. The limitations you once accepted need not constrain the person you're becoming now. Third, you begin to experience a peculiar kind of joy, what the Zen masters call the joy of being ordinary. When you're not burdened with maintaining some special important identity, you're free to simply be. Like a leaf on the wind, like a wave on the ocean, you can move with the currents of life rather than struggling against them. This is what the mystics mean by surrender, by letting go. It's not about giving up or becoming passive. It's about recognizing the reality of constant change and flowing with it rather than against it. It's about dying willingly to each moment so that you can be fully born into the next. And in this willing surrender, this acceptance of constant dissolution, lies a freedom more profound than anything the ego could imagine. For when you no longer fear death, including the small deaths of each passing moment, you're finally free to truly live. In Hindu mythology, there's a marvelous figure known as Shiva Nataraja, the lord of the dance. He's typically depicted with 4 arms, dancing within a ring of fire. With one hand, he beats a drum that represents the rhythm of creation. With another, he holds a flame symbolizing destruction. And his dance, the Tandava, represents the endless cycle of creation, preservation, and dissolution that constitutes the cosmos. I've always found this to be a magnificent symbol of the principle we're exploring. Life isn't just creation, and it isn't just destruction. It's the dance between the two. And this dance isn't happening somewhere out there in the universe, it's happening within you at every moment. Think about your own experience. Each new idea requires the dissolution of an old certainty. Each new phase of life requires the death of a previous phase. Each inhalation requires the completion of an exhalation. Creation and destruction, like 2 dancers, moving together in perfect harmony. Most of us, however, want only half the dance. We want creation, growth, expansion, but not destruction, decline, contraction. We want eternal spring and summer, but not autumn or winter. We want the drum of creation, but not the flame of dissolution. Yet consider how impossible, how utterly stagnant such a world would be. Without destruction, creation would have no space in which to occur. Without death, life would have no way to renew itself. Without endings, there could be no beginnings. So what happens when you embrace both aspects of the dance? When you recognize that the you who dies each moment is making space for a new you to be born. When you see that your life, just like Shiva's dance, is this endless rhythm of becoming and dissolving, you find yourself at the very center of the cosmic dance. You discover that you're not just the dancer, you're the dance itself. And in this recognition lies a peculiar kind of ecstasy, a joy that contains within it all of life's light and shadow, its births and deaths, its crescendos and diminuendos. This is why I say, you've already died yesterday and will die again today. You are Shiva, dancing, creating, and destroying yourself with every passing moment. And there's nothing morbid about this. It's the most vibrant, vital, alive thing imaginable. For in this constant dying and being reborn, you participate directly in the fundamental nature of existence itself. Now let's venture into something rather fascinating about this whole business of dying and being reborn each moment. It has profound implications for how we understand time itself. You see, we typically think of time as a straight line, stretching from past to future, with us somewhere in the middle, in what we call the present. But this model creates all sorts of peculiar problems and paradoxes. Where exactly is this line? How long is the present moment? Where does the past go when it's over? Where is the future before it arrives? These aren't just philosophical puzzles. They point to something fundamentally misleading about how we conceptualize time. What if time isn't a line at all? What if it's more like a vast ocean, and what we call the present moment is simply the particular wave that we're riding right now? The past isn't back there somewhere. It's simply waves that have already broken. The future isn't up ahead. It's waves that have yet to form. In this model, you're not moving through time. Time is moving through you, like waves passing through the ocean. Each moment is a complete cycle of birth and death, a miniature lifetime contained within the larger span of your years. When you start to experience time in this way, something extraordinary happens. You begin to sense what the mystics call the eternal now, the timeless dimension that exists within and beyond each passing moment. You discover that within the momentary is contained the eternal. This is what Jesus meant when he said, "Before Abraham was, I am." It's what Zen masters point to when they speak of your original face before you were born. It's the recognition that beneath the surface play of time, the constant dying and being reborn, there's a dimension of being that never changes, never comes into existence, and never goes out of existence. So you've died yesterday, and you'll die today, but that's only true from the perspective of conventional time, of waves on the surface. From the perspective of the ocean depths, nothing is ever born, and nothing ever dies. There's just the eternal dance of forms arising and dissolving within the vast, unmoving awareness that you fundamentally are. And when you touch this dimension, even for a moment, the fear of death, both the big death at life's end and the small deaths of each passing moment, dissolves completely. For how can you fear the loss of what you never really had, or the end of what never really began? So where does all this leave us? If we're constantly dying and being reborn, if the me is merely a convenient fiction, if time itself isn't what we thought it was, how are we to live? What practical wisdom can we glean from these rather esoteric insights? I'd like to suggest something I call the art of dying daily. It's a practice, a way of being in the world that honors this constant dissolution and renewal. First, start your day with a simple acknowledgement. The person who went to sleep last night is gone. You are someone new today. Your body has changed, your mind has changed, the world around you has changed. You're being reborn in this moment. What kind of person will you choose to be? Second, practice dying to your fixed notions about yourself. Whenever you catch yourself thinking, "I'm the kind of person who," or "I could never," pause. Remember that these are just stories about a self that no longer exists. You're free to write new stories, to become someone new. Third, practice dying to each moment as it passes. Don't cling to experiences, whether pleasant or unpleasant. Let them arise, let them be, and let them dissolve. Like watching clouds form and disperse in the sky, observe the constant flux of thoughts, feelings, and sensations without attempting to grasp them or push them away. Fourth, practice dying to your expectations. Most of our suffering comes from demanding that life be different than it is. We want permanence in an impermanent world. We want certainty in an uncertain universe. We want to be special, important, lasting, when in reality we're as transient as morning dew. Let all these expectations die, and see what remains. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, practice dying to the fear of death itself. Recognize that the big death at life's end is just a more dramatic version of what's already happening in every moment. If you can make peace with the small deaths of each passing instant, the big death loses much of its terror. Now, I'm not suggesting this is easy. The ego, with its desperate clinging to permanence, is a wily fellow. It will resist these insights with all its might. It will tell you that without a solid, permanent me, life would be meaningless. It will try to convince you that embracing impermanence leads to nihilism or despair. But I assure you, the opposite is true. When you stop fighting against the fundamental nature of reality, this constant dying and being reborn, you discover a freedom and aliveness that's unavailable to the person desperately clinging to some fixed identity. You discover that you're like the ocean, not just the wave. The waves of your individual existence are constantly rising and falling, being born and dying. But the ocean itself, the deeper awareness that you fundamentally are, remains. It contains all these births and deaths without itself being subject to birth or death. And in that recognition lies a peace that passes understanding, a joy beyond circumstances, and a love that isn't dependent on permanence. For when you're no longer afraid of dying, either the small deaths of each moment or the big death at life's end, you're finally free to truly live. So you see, my friends, there's a peculiar paradox at work here. By embracing the fact that you've already died yesterday and will die again today, by fully accepting the impermanence at the heart of existence, you open yourself to a dimension of being that never dies at all. This isn't some airy abstraction or philosophical wordplay. It's a direct invitation to experience life as it actually is, rather than as your mind imagines it to be. It's an invitation to die before you die, to recognize the illusory nature of the separate self while you're still breathing. And in that recognition, in that willing surrender to the constant flux of existence, you find what all the great wisdom traditions have been pointing to, that beyond all coming and going, beyond all birth and death, there's a timeless awareness, a boundless presence that you fundamentally are. So don't be afraid to die today. You've done it countless times already. And each time, you've been reborn anew. The only question is, will you resist this process, creating suffering for yourself, or will you embrace it, discovering the liberation that comes with letting go? The choice, as always, is yours. But I rather hope you'll join me in this peculiar dance of dying and being reborn moment by moment. For in this dance, though it may seem strange to say it, is found the very secret of life itself.